In 1881, a rancher took one look at the woman the supply wagon delivered and called the match a waste of postage. The town of Bitter Springs agreed she was too small and too foreign to last a week, and with the first snow 8 weeks off, they bet she'd freeze or starve first. What none of them knew was that the lacquered box she carried held her grandmother's carpentry tools, seeds in oiled paper, and a discipline no one in that territory had a name for. She didn't leave, and by the time the snow broke, the town that called her too weak would be sheltering inside the walls she built with her own hands. Stay until the end to see how a woman they said couldn't survive brought a frontier town to its knees without once raising her voice, and if it moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The supply wagon rolled into Bitter Springs just past dawn, hauling feed and salt, and one passenger who had no business riding a freight route through Wyoming territory. Suzu sat on a sack of grain, with her lacquered cedar box braced between her knees, her canvas roll tucked behind her back, watching the town assemble itself out of the morning dust. From the wagon she took in what the town had to offer: a church spire with no bell, a general store with a crooked sign, and 3 saloons for a place that barely held 200 souls, which told her everything she needed to know about how the long nights passed in a town like this. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach this street, and the man who was supposed to meet her was already waiting with a letter in his hand and a face going hard. Tucker Cole stood beside the wagon with the matchmaker's photograph pinched between his fingers, comparing the picture to the woman on the sacks. The photograph had been kind to her, making her look taller and fuller, the kind of sturdy, frontier wife a rancher orders when he needs hands that can pull a calf and a back that can carry a winter. The woman on the wagon was small, narrow through the shoulders, jet black hair pulled tight, a face of sharp angles and high cheekbones and dark eyes that gave nothing back. He read her the way a man reads a bad deal, and his jaw set before he spoke a word. "This isn't what I paid for." The wagon driver glanced away. Tucker's foreman, Nash, sat his horse a few yards off, with his hat low, watching the street because watching the boss was the same as agreeing with him, and he didn't want to agree yet. A knot of men had gathered on the store porch to see the foreign mail-order bride arrive, and every one of them was grinning the way men grin when they expect a show. Tucker didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. "The match is void. I won't keep a woman on the place who can't pull her weight." He set the photograph down on the wagon board like a receipt he was returning. "Stage comes through in 8 or 9 days. I'll cover the fare back to the railhead. Until then, the preacher's wife might take you in or she might not." He walked away before she could answer, which was its own kind of answer. Nash touched his hat brim without looking at her and followed the boss up the street, and the men on the porch didn't bother to lower their voices. They called her the Chinawoman, the little heathen, the mail-order mistake, betting each other how many days she'd last before the cold or the hunger ran her out. One of them said she ought to try the cribs on the south end of town, and the others laughed, and the laughter carried down the empty street like something blown on the wind. Suzu didn't correct them. She had learned on the long ride from the coast that correcting Westerners about where she was from cost more than it bought. So she lifted the cedar box onto her hip, settled the canvas roll across one shoulder, and stepped down off the wagon into the dust. The box was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its size. Inside it rode her grandmother's tools, the seed she had carried through 3 changes of train and 2 of wagon, and the small quiet inheritance of a craft her family had practiced longer than this town had existed. She stood in the street the way a carpenter stands over a broken frame, reading the structure of the place, what was sound, what was rotten, what she could use. The general store's door scraped open, and a woman came out with a tin cup of water and a piece of dry bread on a plate. She was the shopkeeper's wife, broad-faced and tired, and she pressed the cup into Suzu's hands without a word of welcome, because welcome was a currency she wasn't sure she could spend in this town. Suzu drank, and the water tasted of iron and creek mud, and she set the cup back on the plate and thanked her in a voice low enough that only the woman heard. The shopkeeper's wife glanced once toward the porch where the men still watched. "Be gone before the first snow. It comes early in the basin, earlier than they'll tell you." Suzu nodded. She didn't say she'd leave, and the woman didn't ask her to promise it. What passed between them wasn't kindness exactly, not friendship, but the small, cold recognition of two people who understood that a town like this could kill a woman alone and feel nothing about it after. Suzu turned her back on the porch and the laughter and walked down the street toward the land office, the box on her hip, and the morning sun throwing her shadow long and thin across the dust. The land office was a plank shack leaning against the back of the assayers, and the man behind the counter didn't look up when she walked in because he didn't expect a foreign woman to come buying land. He had a homestead map pinned to the wall with the federal parcels marked in red, 160 acres to any citizen or immigrant meaning to become one. 5 years of living on it and improving it, and the deed was yours. Suzu studied the map while he shuffled his papers, and she knew, before she asked, that the red parcels weren't for her. The law handed those acres to men who could swear they were citizens, or meant to be, and the territory had already decided what a woman from Japan was and wasn't allowed to become. I'm not here for a homestead claim. I want to buy what nobody else wants. That made him look up. He had a list of the hard luck parcels, the ones that had changed hands twice and come back to the county for unpaid tax, the ground no decent rancher would touch. The bottomland along Bitter Creek was the worst of them. 80 acres of creek-bitten flat that flooded each spring, thick with brush and dead cottonwood, abandoned twice in 5 years by men who couldn't make it pay. He quoted her price. That was almost an insult, low enough to make clear he expected to see it back on his list before the year was out. Suzu counted out the coin from the dowry purse sewn into the lining of her coat, the last money her family had been able to send with her, and she signed the deed with the careful Western letters she had practiced on the train. The clerk took the coin, filed the paper, and told her the land was hers, and the trouble that came with it was hers too. She walked the 2 miles down to the creek in the late afternoon, the box growing heavier with every step, the canvas roll chafing her shoulder, raw through the cotton. The bottomland opened up before her like a wound in the basin, low and tangled, the creek cutting a brown scar across it, dead cottonwoods standing like bones against the sky. There was a shack on the rise above the flood line, a sod-sided lean-to, left by the last man who had tried and failed, its door hanging crooked, its single window stuffed with rags. She didn't despair at the sight of it. Despair was a luxury that cost time, and she had 8 weeks. She read the ground the way she had been taught to read a field, walking the whole 80 acres before the light failed, noting where the water pooled in spring, where the sun hit longest on the south-facing slope above the flood line, and where the wind funneled through the gap and would tear a poorly placed wall apart. She found the old garden patch the last owner had scratched and abandoned, the soil thin and sour, but salvageable, and she found a seep that could be dug into a well. By the time the dark came, she had the whole place mapped in her head, and she had a plan that would have looked familiar to her grandmother and impossible to everyone in Bitter Springs. That first night she slept in the sod shack with the box for a pillow and the canvas roll for a door, and the cold came through the walls like a living thing. The previous tenant had left a kerosene lamp with an inch of oil in the bottom, and she lit it, and the shack filled with the flickering amber light that kerosene throws. Nothing like the steady white she'd have wanted, warm and unsteady and alive. She opened the cedar box for the first time since the coast. The tools lay in their fitted slots, dark wood handles worn smooth by a hand smaller than her own, the edges still sharp because her grandmother had taught her that a dull blade is a lazy blade. Beneath the tools sat packets of seed in oiled paper, each one labeled in the brushstrokes she had learned to read before she learned Western letters, and beneath the seeds lay a folded paper of needles, so fine they caught no light, with one long bundle wrapped in oiled cloth that she didn't open yet. She touched the bundle once, then closed the box and latched it and blew out the lamp. Before she slept, she took a stick and scratched her plan into the dirt floor of the shack, the way her family scratched plans into the earth of their fields, marking the cabin on the rise where the wind couldn't corner it, the garden on the south slope, the well at the seep, and the storage cut into the bank below the garden where the ground stayed cool. The lines were simple and exact, the shape of a life she intended to keep. The town sent a boy down the next morning to spy. The storekeeper's son paid in candy to report what the foreign woman was doing. He crept to the edge of the brush and watched her crouched in the dirt beside the shack, scratching in the mud with a stick, talking to herself in words he couldn't understand. He ran back up the road and told the men on the porch that the Chinawoman was drawing pictures in the dirt and talking to spirits, and the men laughed, and one of them drawled that she could play at farming. The creek would take it all in the spring anyway. They didn't send the boy back. They had already decided what her story would be, and they settled in to watch it happen the way a town settles in to watch a slow fire go out. At dawn, she walked to the nearest stand of dead cottonwood along the creek and started felling. She had borrowed an axe from the store on credit against her first harvest, the clerk giving it up with a smirk and a warning that she'd bring it back dull and unused. The first tree took her most of the morning. The wood was dry and hard, and she was small, and the axe was heavier than the ones her grandmother had kept. But she had been taught to fell before she was taught to read, and by the second tree she had found the rhythm, the angle, the way to let the weight of the head do the work her arms couldn't. By the end of the second day she had 6 logs dragged up to the rise, and the men on the store porch had stopped laughing and started watching the road. She hewed the logs flat on 2 faces with the broadaxe, the way a Westerner would, because the walls needed flat faces to seat against each other. Where a frontier cabin used iron nails at the corners and notched the logs to lock them, she did something the Basin had never seen. She cut the joints by hand with her grandmother's chisels, carving the wood so each log interlocked with the next. Mortise into tin, piece fitted to piece, the Kigami method her grandmother's people had used to raise temples that outlasted the storms and the centuries. There were no nails and no iron at the corners, only wood married to wood, cut so precisely that the joint held by its own geometry. On the frontier, forged nails were scarce and dear, bought by the handful and hoarded, and a woman who could raise walls without them was doing something the carpenters couldn't quite name and couldn't quite dismiss. A traveling carpenter passed through on the 3rd day, heading west for the rail camps, and he stopped on the ridge above her claim and watched her seat a corner joint. He stayed an hour, then came down once and ran his thumb along the joint and asked her, in a voice that wasn't sure it wanted the answer, what she called that fit. She told him. He didn't recognize the word, and he packed his tools and rode on, and she heard later that he'd told the bartender at the Silver Dollar that the foreign woman was building a cabin held together by witchcraft and patience. The bartender had said that was a hell of a combination and poured him another. The storm came on the 5th day, the kind the Basin throws without warning. A wall of black coming up the creek with the rain slanting sideways and the wind screaming through the cottonwoods. She had 3 walls half raised, the 4th still on the ground, the corners seated but not braced, and she heard it before she saw it, the sound of it coming through the gap like something with teeth. She ran for the walls with rope and the leftover logs and braced what she could, driving stakes, lashing the corners, but the wind hit the half-built walls like a hand, and 2 logs rolled and one cracked clean through at a bad joint. Rain turned the rise to mud, and she worked through it on her knees, resetting the rolled logs, recutting the cracked joint in the dark with numb fingers, the chisel slipping once and opening her palm to the bone. She wrapped the hand in a strip of her skirt and kept cutting. By dawn the corners held, and they held because the joints transferred the load the way her grandmother had promised, each piece carrying the next, the whole frame refusing to give because no single point bore the whole weight alone. She stood on her own walls as the sun came up, mud to the knee, blood on her hand, the cedar box dry beneath the lean-to where she had dragged it. Nash drove a buckboard up the ridge road that morning, hauling a load of tack and feed to the coal ranch on the high ground, and he pulled the team up and looked down at her standing on the walls she had raised alone. He didn't say anything. He sat there long enough that the horses shifted under him, and then he touched the brim of his hat and drove on. He had expected her gone by then. She was higher than he was, and she was still there. The walls were up, but the ground hadn't been tested yet. And neither had the one skill the town would need from her before the winter was through. With the walls up, she turned to the ground that would feed her through the winter, and the ground fought her for every inch. The south slope above the flood line was thin and sour, the topsoil washed down to the creek years before, and a western farmer would have written it off and prayed for a dry spring. Suzu didn't pray for the soil, because ground answers work and not prayer, so she set about changing it instead. She terraced the creek bank with the dead cottonwood she couldn't use for logs, building raised beds the spring flood couldn't reach, and she dug in charcoal from her fire pit and compost from the creek bottom and the swept leavings of the lean-to, amending the poor ground the way her family amended the poor fields at home. The town had bet the creek would drown her garden before harvest, and the creek tried twice. In both times the terraces held the water back and let it drain slow through the beds instead of tearing them out. She planted the oiled paper seeds in rows that looked wrong to any western eye, not the straight single-crop lines a frontier farmer knew, but companions set together, so each one sheltered or fed the one beside it, the tall beans climbing to shade the tender greens, the squash sprawling wide to hold the moisture in the soil beneath. She had brought seeds that could take a short season and a hard frost, because her grandmother had grown them in mountain country where the cold came early and the soil was mean. The garden didn't look like much for the first 3 weeks, and the boy who spied for the store reported that nothing was growing, and the men settled back into their certainty. Then the beds greened all at once, and the green kept coming, and the men on the porch stopped talking about the creek and started watching the road down to the bottomland. It was the wound that cracked the town's certainty open. Nash took a gash in his forearm from a stray nail standing out of a corral plank at the coal ranch, a deep puncture that went foul in 2 days, the flesh around it swelling red and hot, the fever climbing until he couldn't sit a horse steady. Tucker sent him into town for the doctor, but the doctor had ridden north to a calving pasture and wouldn't be back for 3 days, and 3 days was longer than Nash had. He made it as far as the rise above Suzu's claim, riding there by instinct, because it was the closest roof, and he half fell from the saddle at the edge of her garden, with the arm swollen to twice its size and his eyes gone glassy. She didn't ask whether he wanted help, just laid him in the shade of the cabin wall and went for the box. The folded paper of needles came out, and a packet of dried herbs, and a pot of water set to boil on her fire. She cleaned the wound with the boiled water, and packed it with a poultice she mixed from the herbs and a pinch of charcoal, and she set the needles where the pain gathered and where the swelling ran, the points so fine they barely dimpled the skin. She didn't explain any of it, because no one here would have believed the explanation, and explaining had never bought her anything in a town like this. The scene is told in Nash's face, the fear going out of it by degrees, the confusion coming in, and then the sleep that broke the fever before dawn, the deep, heavy sleep of a body that has turned the corner and decided to live. He left at first light with the wound closing clean and a gar of the poultice wrapped in cloth against his ribs. At the edge of the garden he stopped and turned back to her, and the only thing he could think to say was the one thing he owed her. "I owe you my arm for this." The word sat strange in his mouth, because he had never owed a foreign woman anything and wasn't sure how to carry it. He rode up the ridge toward the coal ranch carrying a debt he didn't know how to name. What he didn't do was tell Tucker where he had been or who had saved the arm, he needed to keep his job. He told the boss he had slept it off in town, and Tucker believed him, because Tucker had no reason to think the woman he had turned out had anything worth offering a hurt man. That was the loop the basin didn't know was turning yet. The question that would come due in the cold, and Suzu didn't know it either. She only went back to her garden, and the beans climbed, and the squash held the water in the ground, and the town that had bet on her failure watched the road and said less and less. The harvest came in the 8th week, the week the shopkeeper's wife had warned her about, and instead of the first snow the basin got the last warm days of the season, the sun low and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look forgiving. Suzu's garden gave back more than the bottomland had any right to yield. Squash heavy as stones, beans by the basket, greens still tender after the first cool nights, and root vegetables pulled from the terrace beds clean and firm, the soil the town had called worthless, now producing food enough to fill a wagon. She loaded a buttboard, the workhorse vehicle of the day, the flat-bedded hauler that carried feed and lumber and everything a frontier needed, moved. Not a carriage which was a passenger thing too fragile to do real work. She hitched the borrowed mule and drove the load up the ridge road into Bitter Springs herself, sitting the buttboard straight-backed, with the cedar box lashed behind the seat. The general store owner bought her produce because it was the freshest thing in the basin, the only greens that hadn't been hauled 3 days in a wagon from the railhead. He paid her in coin and a standing offer for the winter stores, and she sold the lot in an hour. Townsfolk who had called her the Chinal woman for 2 months came to the back of the buttboard and asked her name, badly mangling the single word between them, and she answered plainly each time. "My name is Suzu." She didn't soften when they tried again, and got it wrong a second time, just said it again the same way, and let them decide. Tucker Cole was in town that morning buying tack at the farrier's, a new bridle and a set of hobbles, and he came out onto the plank walk when he heard the buckboard in the crowd. He saw her sitting the seat with the empty crates stacked behind her and the line of buyers, and Nash, his own foreman, stepping out of the crowd to load her empty crates onto the buckboard without being asked, handling them careful, the way a man handles something that belongs to someone he owes. Tucker's jaw set. He had pictured her starving on the bottomland, the creek taking her garden, and the cold taking her cabin, and the territory taking the rest. He hadn't pictured her feeding the town that had bet against her, and the sight of it sat wrong. In him a stone in a place he couldn't reach to dislodge. A merchant from the next basin rode in that afternoon, having heard a foreign woman was selling winter stores, and he offered her a standing contract for the cold months, so much, a bushel delivered. She negotiated the price, quiet and exact, not raising her voice, not moving from the buttboard seat, holding the number, until he came up to meet it, and then she signed. The shopkeeper's wife watched the whole thing from the store door, the same woman who had given her water and bread on the first morning and told her to be gone before the snow, and she said nothing, but her face had changed. There was something in it that might have been respect and might have been the beginning of shame, and she turned back into the store before Suzu could see which one was winning. By the time Suzu drove the empty buckboard down the ridge road that evening, the story had moved through Bitter Springs faster than the produce had sold. The foreign woman wasn't starving. The foreign woman wasn't leaving. He had signed a contract and fed the town and sat her buttboard like she owned the road. The men on the porch didn't laugh about her anymore, and some of them had bought her squash for supper. The land that no one had wanted was suddenly, quietly, worth wanting, which is the way a town like that always decides it's time to take something from someone who built it alone. The trouble came in the shape of a man named Hargrove, a land speculator, who worked the basins the way a coyote works the edge of a herd, picking off the weak and the unguarded and the conveniently alone. He had heard, the way speculators hear, that a foreign woman held 80 good bottomland acres, with a deed in her name and no man behind it, and he had ridden in with a forged prior claim in his saddlebag and 2 hired men at his back. He was a big man with a clean hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that asks a woman if she knows what's good for her while pretending to be polite about it. He rode down to her claim on a morning when she was mending the garden fence before the cold, and he laid his paper on the buckboard seat and told her, pleasant as a Sunday, that the land she had bought had already been claimed the year before by a man whose signature she had never heard of, a man who had, on Hargrove's paper, signed his rights over for a sum. He gave her 3 days to clear off, and he said it like a favor, like he was saving her the trouble of a judge. She read the paper and saw the date and the name and the seal, and she saw that the seal was wrong and the date didn't match the county record she had signed, and she said nothing, and she didn't take the paper, and she didn't promise to leave. The town wouldn't help her. She knew that before she asked, and she didn't ask. The sheriff was a week east chasing a horse thief across the territorial line, and the men on the porch had already decided that a foreign woman's deed wasn't worth a local man's trouble. Tucker heard about it the way he heard everything, from Nash, who told him flat that someone was riding on the Japanese woman's land. Tucker said it wasn't his problem. He said she had made her choice to stay, and a woman alone on a hard claim had to carry her own weight, which was the same cold logic he had used the morning he turned her off the wagon, and it sat just as wrong in Nash's stomach the second time. Nash said nothing more. He waited for dark, and then he rode down to the bottomland to watch the claim from the ridge, because he owed her an arm, and he wasn't the kind of man who let a debt sit. The second night, Hargrove's men came down to scare her off instead of waiting for the third day. They set the cabin's porch alight, kerosene on the boards, the flame catching fast in the dry wood. She was inside with the lamp lit, and the light through the door went from amber to orange to the bright hungry white of a fire taking hold. She didn't run. She came out with a bucket and the wet sack she kept by the door and threw creek water and sand on the flame, beating it down before it reached the walls, and the walls didn't feed the fire the way a nailed cabin would have, because the kagumi joints were tight and partly green, and they resisted the burn where loose dry boards would have gone up. He saved the cabin, standing in the smoke with the wet sack in her hands and the porch shard black behind her, and she didn't leave. Hargrove came at dawn to find her still standing, and that was the morning the box gave up its last secret. She was in the cabin doorway with the long wrapped bundle open across her knees, and inside the cloth lay a naginata, her grandmother's blade on a long pole, the steel dark and oiled and older than the territory. She didn't threaten him with it, didn't raise it or swing it or speak loud. The way she held it, balanced and still, was the way only a person taught from childhood holds a weapon, and she stood in the door and looked at him the way she had looked at Tucker on the wagon, giving nothing back. Her voice stayed plain and low when she told him she had bought the land and paid for it and held the deed, and he could take his paper to a judge or leave it on her ground, and either way she wasn't moving. The calm was the thing that undid him, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst, and Hargrove read it, and read the tight walls and the foreman sitting his horse on the ridge above, and he understood that the woman he had come to rob wasn't going to be robbed. He folded his paper, mounted, and rode out the way he had come, and the 2 hired men followed him, and the bottomland was hers again. Nash had ridden for Tucker in the dark, and Tucker came over the ridge after Hargrove was already gone. He reined in at the charred porch, and the woman still standing in the door with the long blade across her knees, and the cold, sick understanding came into his face that he had stayed on his high ground, while a woman he had thrown away defended alone the land he had told her she couldn't hold. Nash watched him from the ridge and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the scorched porch and the still woman weren't already saying. Tucker turned his horse and rode back toward the ranch without a word. Suzu set the naginata back in its cloth, latched the box, and went to find water for the mule. And her hands were shaking now that no one was watching, the adrenaline leaving her in a slow, cold tide, and she let them shake while she walked to the creek, and then she stopped letting them shake, and she went back to work. The storm the shopkeeper's wife had warned her about came 3 weeks later, and it came worse than anyone alive in the basin had seen. It built for 3 days the way the old storms build, the sky going the color of a bruise, the wind dropping to a silence that put the stock on edge. Lynn the White came down the creek in a wall and didn't stop for 3 days. Driven snow, the kind that seals a door shut and buries a barn to the eaves and kills a man who walks 20 yards from his own porch. Bitter Springs had gone into the winter thinner than anyone admitted, because the big cattle drive had sold off the surplus that summer for cash, and the general store had underbought on provisions, betting on a mild season, and now the basin was locked and the shelves were bare, and the cold was the can that could kill. Suzu's cabin held. The walls she had raised without a nail sat solid in the wind, the kagumi joints transferring the load the way they had done in the flash storm, the chinking and daubing sealing every gap so the air inside stayed still while the air outside screamed. Her root cellar, cut into the bank below the garden, was full of the harvest she had stored, against exactly this squash and roots and dried beans and the salted greens she had put by. Her fire was lit, her lamp was lit, her walls were dry, and she was the only house in the basin that didn't lose a wall to the wind. By the second night she was also the only house in the basin with food to spare. They started arriving after dark on the second night, drawn by the lamp in her window, the one steady amber light in a basin gone black and white. First came a ranch hand from the south spread, half frozen, his horse left bogged in a drift, then a farm couple from the upper creek, with the woman's hands going blue from the cold, then the storekeeper and his wife, the same woman who had given her water and told her to be gone, now coming through the storm to the door of the woman she had warned to leave. Suzu took them in. She fed them from her stores, a pot on the fire, bread she had baked the day before the storm broke, and she treated the ones with frostbite with the needles and the herbs, working through the night the way she had worked on Nash, her hands steady, her voice low, the box open beside the fire. The woman they had called the China woman for 3 months was the only reason half the people in that cabin were alive, and every one of them knew it, and not one of them said it out loud, because saying it would have been to admit what the town had done. Tucker came last. Nash brought him, half frozen, across the saddle, a gash in his leg from a beam that had come down in the coal ranch barn when the wind took the roof. He was conscious enough to know whose door they were carrying him through, and the knowing of it was its own kind of cold, worse than the storm. Suzu didn't turn him away, and she didn't say a word about the wagon or the street or the morning he had called her a waste of postage. She laid him by the fire and cleaned the gash and set the needles and packed the poultice, the same hands, the same craft, the same silence. The protective claim came from her this time and not from him, and she stood between him and the cold the way he had once stood between her and the street and chosen to walk away, and the inversion of it wasn't lost on him, lying there in the warmth she had built, watching her move in the amber light. In the firelight, with the storm howling outside and the fever leaving him by degrees, Tucker understood for the first time that the woman he had rejected had saved his foreman's arm and now his leg and his life, and that he had earned none of it, and that she owed him nothing, and that she was giving it anyway. The loop the basin hadn't known was turning came due in that firelight, and it closed without a word, the way the important things in that town always closed. The third dawn broke the storm. The sky went from black to a pale hard blue, the snow lay on the basin like a held breath, and one by one the people in the cabin rose and pulled on their coats and filed out into the white silence. Not one of them called her the China woman on the way out. They called her Suzu or Mrs. Pecha. Suzu, or simply her name said, with the careful respect they had refused her for 3 months, and the storekeeper's wife pressed her hand once at the door and didn't speak, because there was nothing to say that the last 3 nights hadn't already said. Tucker stayed behind. He sat by the dead fire and tried to thank her, tried to say something about the morning at the wagon, about the match, about all the cold logic he had used to turn a woman out into a street and then leave her to build a life alone. She let the silence sit, didn't make it easy for him, and didn't punish him either, because pity and cruelty were both more than he had earned, and she had never been the kind to spend what she didn't need to. When she spoke, she told him plainly she had built the home for herself and not for an apology, and that he was welcome to leave when the road cleared and welcome to stay until it did. He left when the road cleared, and from the ridge above the bottomland he looked back at the cabin, the garden under snow, the tight walls, the woman standing in the doorway, exactly as she had stood the morning he rejected her, except now the whole basin knew what he hadn't been willing to see. She didn't watch him go. She turned back to the porch. Hargrove's men had burned because the spring comes early in the basin, and there was a board to plane and a frame to mend, and the work didn't care who had been wrong about her. The town that had said she was too weak to survive now depended on her stores and her skill and her stubborn refusal to be run off, and that was a kind of respect, and whether it was the kind that sees a person or only the kind that sees a use was a question the town hadn't yet earned the right to answer. By the time the snow melted, Suzu was already planting the second year's garden, alone, the cedar box open beside her, the shavings falling from her plane like the first light on the creek. She had built what they said she couldn't, and the only person left in Bitter Springs who hadn't yet reckoned with what that meant was the town itself. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.